Hi, thank you for your presentation. Sien, I've got a question for you. I think you got some weight on your shoulders because you have to build so many social housing units the coming years. And it somehow reminded me of the post-war housing need that we had in the Netherlands. And I was just wondering, how can you live up to have a certain quality and at the same time make sure that you can actually build so many houses that you need? Because in retrospect now we see that many of the houses that we've been building just after the World War are demolished or revitalized because we built so many at that time and we were not thinking a lot about the quality of the housing itself. But how can you kind of incorporate that question in the work that you have to do the coming years?
Thank you very much. Very important question also because the sites that we're talking about in 99 years, the buildings come back to the city. People will say, well, what happens in 99 years? Well, the city gets the land, but we would also get the buildings. So we have an interest in those buildings being high quality. It also came up in the public meetings where the public thought that we were building former public housing. And so I had to walk the public and the local residents through the fact that this wasn't public housing. It was housing that was going to be managed by third parties. We've also, though, found, particularly, we have a small purpose-built rental housing industry in the city that really is a industry of families after the war that develop rental housing. They still have those portfolios, and they are also now interested in our small building industry of rental housing. They understand as well, because it's rental housing, that issues of energy efficiency will be very important because it will control their costs. And it's a big challenge for us to ask them for 99 years of affordability for 1/3 of the housing stock. This is a really big deal. They're going to achieve that, though, through the other 2/3 of the housing that is built, either as a market rental or market condo. But energy efficiency standards and maintaining those buildings is very high on their list. Lastly, through my office, I provide a series of specifications that they will be required also to build to. So I have a number of architects on my staff at the city who have helped us prepare specifications for the buildings. Yeah, so like these are quite big challenges, but I think we've got the ingredients to get good buildings out of this process. In fact, our rental housing developers in the city are building better buildings than our condominium developers, because our condominium developers, once they've sold, they're gone. And they're more than happy to pass that crappy product on to somebody else. But the rental housing folks have, which is why we have designed it with 2/3 of the development to be rental housing.
Another question?
Hi, my name is Janet McCubbin. I work for the City of Calgary. And you guys talked a lot about having your nonprofit and your for-profit developers partnering on some of these projects. And I was just wondering if you could talk a little bit about what challenges that has brought to you. I mean, with regards to two different types of developers working together and how you might have resolved those challenges.
Okay. That's what you think. I'm a non-profit company.
I think it's fair to say that there isn't a social housing unit in Canada that hasn't been built with some involvement from the private sector, whether that be in construction or design. So generally speaking, all of the sectors are involved in delivering affordable rental housing. In Vancouver, we have a similar situation where we have a lot of nonprofits who are smaller. But I would say in the last 10 years, we've seen some of them trying to consolidate and grow quickly. And we've also seen them developing an appetite to take on more risk and to actually do development themselves. So there is an emerging non-profit development sector as well. which I think we do our best to try and support, because ultimately any profit that they charge on a development, they are reinvesting in the development itself. So it makes sense, you can deliver more affordability, but you can't not rely on the private sector.
Great question. Couple of points. I've lived in nonprofit housing myself on 2 different occasions, so I understand that sector. For 5 years in Toronto, I worked for the Labour Council Development Foundation, which is our labor movement, and I was building co-op housing for them as a development consultant. So I come to this in my current role, both from, if you will, lived experience, but also in having developed cooperative housing. What we did as part of our Housing Now initiative, we put $1 million into a capacity fund for nonprofit groups, and they can apply to me, to my office, for grants to help them in the proposal call process. And secondly, we have told the private sector groups that for them to be considered as a part of the bidding process, they have to bring a nonprofit partner. So those are a number of things where we have tried to assist that sector. Unfortunately, within our national housing strategy to date, we have no capacity building funds for nonprofit organizations. It's one of the areas that the national housing strategy could be improved in a second phase.
Hi, Greg Dooling from Capital Region Housing in Edmonton. My questions are around the role of municipalities, how they impact the success or challenge in developing affordable housing, both on the administrative side and on the political side. I'm wondering what you see as some successes and some ways to overcome challenges.
Good question. So in Paris Habitat, we are very linked to the city of Paris because, for example, the president of Paris Habitat is a deputy mayor of the city of Paris, and we work closely, really closely together every week with the administration of the city. And myself and my teams are working every day also with all the mayor of the 20 arrondissements in Paris. So we work every day, so it's the daily work, and also we have, you said it's called the chart of objective and moyen purpose. I think between us, between the 3 social housing company linked to the city of Paris, with the city of Paris, with different items on the price to build, the number of tenants, and the number of carekeepers, of many subjects, which we have to follow them. And also there is people in the administration. It's called the general inspection, and they come often to see our works, to control the budget. So we are very, very close to the city of Paris.
From my perspective, there are 2 key things that we do to help and 1 key thing that we do that doesn't help. The 2 big things that we do to help is we invest a lot of money into the development and maintenance of affordable housing. Right now, our 4-year capital budget is around $500 million into affordable housing, which is a huge investment from a level of government that does not collect the tax revenue to make that kind of investment. So that's a big deal, and is linked to the other thing which we do to help that also Sean reflected is political leadership. So it would be impossible for us to do some of the things that we're doing without the backstop and support of our politicians, because we could not send staff out to have difficult conversations with communities about change, about the introduction of shelters and supportive housing in their communities if we weren't going to be able to see those conversations through. The thing that we do that doesn't help is the amount of time it takes us to approve anything in relation to housing. And I say this knowing that my colleagues in the planning department, we're all on board to do this together, but the volume of applications that we have seen over the last 10 years is unprecedented. And it's taking us a while to figure out how to genuinely prioritize those projects with affordable housing, but we're working on it. And it's a key focus moving forward.
In the last decade, what we've seen is what was a problem that was essentially identified as people that were poor to the housing crisis now being one also that is affecting the middle class or those that would want to join the middle class. So 10 years ago, it was more difficult to attract attention and to get resources necessary. Today, the case is not a social case only, it's an economic case in terms of the vitality and the livability and the prosperity of the city. And so there's a much broader case and there's a much larger consensus among the population for the need for action. As well, if you look at it globally, but also within the Canadian context, by 2050, 90% of our population is living in your city and my city and Vancouver. So this is not an issue that is either going to go away or that we won't have to grapple with. That being said, the secret to my approach, and Vincent from Toronto Community Housing is making a presentation to you tomorrow about the revitalization of a large neighborhood in our city, is I take the politicians to the people, and they may not represent that particular area of the city. And I had the deputy mayor 20 years ago to our Regent Park district, which he'd driven by in a car, but he had never gone into. He was told you shouldn't go there. It was a neighborhood you couldn't get a pizza delivered to, you couldn't post a mail, a taxi wouldn't come, and he was blown away that this was like in his backyard. And so getting them in front of people, because at the end of the day, all of these plans we're talking about, if all we're talking about is plans and architecture don't vote. People vote. And so put them in front of your advocates and to the people, whether it's a Chamber of Commerce or whether it's a tenants organization, and they will begin to understand what their voters want, and that will convince them.
That's great.
I have two questions, not one. So my first one regarding the federal and provincial funds come to your city with a lot of requirements for energy efficiency, that number of sustainability, or accessibility. How that will impact your forecast for the budget? This is my first question. My second question, a little bit complicated. Starting from 2008, there is a revolution in the world economic world situation, and there is new vision for that world. Starting from like they start to talk about blockchain, visual ownership, smart rent, and these things. Did you explore the new way of thinking to secure funds to the housing from that new technologies or new ideas? Thank you.
Okay, so the first part of your question is the impact of federal provincial funds in relation to sustainability and accessibility. Well, first we'd like to get the funds, because then trying to find out how to make them work from a sustainability and a accessibility, the strings that come with it, is a good problem to have, right? First, you have to get them. Having said that, there are some issues right now with certainly the federal funding streams and the requirements that they have around accessibility, especially for retrofit buildings. It's going to be pretty hard to do some of the things that they want. And I think if we could take a step back and think about the overall objectives, there might be a way to deliver on those overall objectives, not necessarily building by building. So I look forward to the future opportunities to have those discussions with our new federal colleagues. In terms of the other things that you were mentioning about innovation, one of the biggest changes right now that's happening in the landscape around affordable housing is the financing arrangements. And we're seeing for the first time, I think it's just launching High C, which is the new housing bank. And it's very exciting to see the fact that a kind of boring but essential part of the puzzle, which is who pays, where does the debt come from that pays for the construction and ongoing delivery of supportive housing. That hasn't really changed in its construct for many, many years. And so for the first time, we see a different way to think about it, basically a bond aggregator, a new bank that will take money, pull money from different sources, aggregate that, and then loan it out for lower interest rates for a longer period of time, so a 30-year term, so not having to renew every 10 years, has a significant impact on how much interest will be paid and how much debt, potentially more debt, that can be taken on by those individuals wanting to construct social housing. So it's a new thing that's happening. It's not widely been drawn down yet, but I'm optimistic that this is the future that we're about to embark on.
As part of the presentation, the Housing Now proposal, we have, not knowing whether these projects will qualify for federal funding or financing, we've put that criteria into our specifications so that they essentially would automatically qualify, as opposed to having 2 sets of rules or 3 sets of rules. Our approach has been to be as flexible as possible, but to ensure that projects aren't knocked out because they haven't done something. And so we're familiar enough, the province really isn't a player, but we're familiar enough with the federal rules that we've, as I say, we've just built it into the basic specifications so that they will meet the environmental and the accessibility requirements. And we're not having to go back and debate that at a later date. Just add one thing, is that the federal requirements under the National Housing Strategy require municipal participation. So if someone has a project, they can't go to the federal government and say, I have a great project, please support it. They have to go to the federal government in Canada with your federal support locked down. So our role, essentially, we are in a very powerful role, which we absolutely need to exercise. Because if we don't exercise that role, there's no other route. So if your municipality locally hasn't figured that out, you're in the driver's seat. And if you're not driving the car, nobody is. So you're not leaving the parking lot.
So even in France, we are now facing new financial problems. The French model of social housing seems to work well from decades and decades. We produced a lot of new social units. We work well with the state, with the local government, and with the national bank. And we in Paris we have every week we have delegation from foreigners delegation to talk about the architecture, but also the financial model. That of course the model wasn't perfect, and we all have many problems. But with the new president, with Emmanuel Macron, he decided to change a few things. First of all, I think it was right. He said there is in France too much social housing companies. We were closely about 800. Now we we are 600 companies. He said if you have less than 12,000 units, you can continue to exist. You have to yes, you have to concentrate much with other companies. I think maybe the 12,000 it's a huge number, but it was true there were too many small companies, as you have in Canada. We also received companies from the Quebec in Paris in September. I was really surprised to see how very small companies they are there. And the second one, he said, because the state wants to reduce its budget to the housing policy, the state give many euros to this. There's two kind of financial for social housing. For the social housing company, it's called les aides à la pierre. It's the building financial, and for the people, for the tenants, it's called les APL. It's called it's a personal fund for people, and it costs the personal funds from people, even if you are in private market or in social housing. It costs, I think, 40 billion euros a year. So it's very, very important in France. And he decided to reduce them, not for private market, but for social housing. And he said to the people, I will reduce your monthly financial help, but don't worry, it will cost nothing to you, because at the same time, I will say to the social housing company to reduce the rental. So for the past 3 years in Paris Habitat, we lost 100 million euros because of the reduce of our rental. So we are a big company, so it's difficult for everyone. We have to change many things. We have to work on the salary cap, and how we build, and so we explore every solution to face this problem. It's really a new change, and the first results actually in France, it's that it makes really afraid all the social housing, especially the smallest one, and the construction is not slowly decreased from the past 2 years for social housing.
Hello, my name is Vincent. I'm a student from U of C. My question is, when you explain the housing plan, you are going it on your own municipality, and then you have zero funding. You wanted to have a zero funding plan from government. In contrast to Abigail's, Vancouver, your plan is that you try, because you mentioned that without government funding, subsidized affordable housing is just a talk and not a reality. Because you cannot bring down the, okay. First of all, I have to commend both of, especially those from Canada, in British terms, Paul is here, it's called civil servants, and I think you are acting on the consciousness of civil servants, which I thank you on behalf. Really, you guys are the, as you say, the last statement you made, Sean, that you guys are powerful, and I agree with you. As planners, as city or municipality, you guys are the check and conscience of the society. And we should bring the people to the politicians. That's one. But what I want to know from you all is that even in France, they work with the government, and we as taxpayers, we are one of the highest tax country in the world. I think that we should be able to get those funds if this is a pressing need? I need to see your views on it, because looks like the two councils are going on a, one has given up on the government and one is like, we really need it. So I just need your comments on it. Thank you.
I'm not sure we're that different, really. I think it's just maybe where we're at in the conversation with our federal, especially our federal partners on funding. We were quite lucky just before the federal election, and because we'd done a similar thing to what Sean was describing, where there's multi-sites and kind of a package or a portfolio of sites, and we were quite lucky with our nonprofit partners that they had put in a really excellent application to the federal government for funding, and we had I guess an approval in principle from the federal government for a substantial amount of money into that portfolio, around $66 million of funding. But that was the first signal for a long time, actually. There was a lot of talk about money coming, we just weren't seeing it actually materialize. We were having lots of discussions, there were lots of projects where we knew applications had been made, but we just weren't seeing kind of things come out the other end. So that was one of the first signals that money was actually going to flow and was coming. I suspect that there will be more. I'm hoping there will be more. Now we're on the other side of a housing-focused election. But there's definitely more work to do to unstick the flow of that money. And largely, I think it's to do with we're a bureaucracy who has been trying to be nimble, agile, creative for the last 10 years in the absence of any of that money. So we have done all the things that you described. You look on every rock, every policy rock to find something to do. The federal government are coming back into the game after a long period of absence, and it feels like the wheels are starting to move, they just feel a bit creaky. And they just need to be oiled, they need to start moving again, they need to get back into the head of being a practitioner and a delivery agent of that fund. I think it will happen. It's just taking longer than we had hoped, but I think it's coming.
Thank you for the comments. As I indicated, this is challenging work. Where we've been, Abigail and I and others have been working, and you feel like you're pushing a snowball up a hill, which in Canadian terms is difficult to do. But even the initiative I've described to you, there's probably 150 civil servants working on it, when a year ago they weren't. And they're really inspired, because now they're not monetizing land to go to the chief financial officer. They're planning for an outcome for their city. And they're really, really inspired by being able to do that. And because they, like everyone else in the city, sees firsthand what's going on. And you'd have to be blind not to see the rise in homelessness in our city, Abigail's city, opiate crisis, crisis in mental health. We have so underinvested since probably, I'm just going to say 1985 maybe, somewhere we went on a different course as a new global economy emerged, and we've stopped investing in people. And our housing crisis is one very obvious element of that, but it pervades the entire Canadian social safety net. That's what we're talking about. And our housing, as I had indicated in my talk, is somehow the magic bullet that's supposed to pick the whole thing up. Well, it's not going to, but it is one of the foundations that's going to help make this possible.
Another question? Then I have a last one. And with Sean, we have to agree to disagree on this one. I think you know, housing now is actually very fine, as opposed to housing whenever. I actually feel, and it's exactly, we've perfected a development model that is profit-driven, and we have the fastest growing cities in the world, and yet we are stuck with outcomes that are going to affect the future and the present of many, many people in our cities and in future generations to come. So maybe housing now is a good way to rally the troops and actually mobilize different levels of government, which brings me to my first question. We talk about political deficit, and obviously at the local level, the two cities have championed that, Vancouver and Toronto. They seem to have a lot of political support and has made a difference. I hope in Calgary we would follow. There is obviously a commitment from the federal government, which still needs to materialize. But how about another player which has a great role to play when it comes to affordable and social housing, and this is provincial governments. What is your take on that, coming from different provinces? And again, this is an open-ended question. You're all experts here in the audience on that. So that is the financial deficit. It's very, very expensive to build the housing that we want, and we saw some great examples last night of excellent quality, also in terms of diversity, in terms of various design strategies, materials, to make sure that that is a home that people want to live in and they are proud of being there. So how do we actually begin to address the financial deficit? And then another player in the mix, which indeed is a very important one, is the private sector. I mean, they have been building our cities in the last 60 years, and they're doing that even in Paris. You know, even Stéphane, you're talking about reaching out to the private landlord now and experimenting with the scheme where they would take on the housing, build it, and manage it, and then maybe turn it over to you at some point 20 years down the road. So two very significant institutions, the provincial governments and the private sector. How do we actually bring them in to do the housing now piece?
Do you want to talk about
Talk about there's maybe one thing I'd like to say. As I said, in Paris we receive a lot of delegation from other country, and also I travel not a lot, but sometimes I'm travel. I went to Mongolia, I went to South Korea, I went to Taipei, and we discussed with many countries in Europe. And actually, I think that most of the cities in the world actually said that they can't continue and to offer to the private market the whole the housing market of their city. Many cities are not saying that they have to regulate more and more the market. They have to create a social housing company. They have to create affordable housing, and it's really a big surprise for me to see how this problem we're facing is a world problem now in every big city, and also all of the cities faces the problem of the climate change, which is very, very important too. I was in Mongolia 3 weeks ago, invited by the social housing company, and they told us, in fact, they are building a lot now social housing, not to make a good condition to live in housing, but the purpose to create social housing units, what the environment, because of the heating system of the youth, because there is no water in the land, so they have to create social housing to preserve the environment. And Ulaanbaatar is the second most polluted city in the world, and also in Paris. We're facing climate change a lot, and now in every public meeting or in the discuss with the city of Paris, everyone talks to us about now what we call in French the confort d'été, the summer comfort. In Paris, we have no air conditioner in the unit, and we won't have it because it's against a non-carbon city. But now it's a major problem for us. We renovated the building for the past decade. We renovated them against the cold, and now we have to, and it makes the rentals decrease for the tenants because they have to spend less for the heat. But now it's really a new period that we're going into.
In terms of the provincial government, Vancouver may be in a slightly better position actually than Toronto right now. We have a provincial housing agency, BC Housing, who are pretty phenomenal actually in the work that they've been doing to deliver housing. They're a great partner of ours. They're doing, to have an agency at a provincial level with a focus on housing has done a lot to provide a foundation in kind of slim years when there isn't a lot of money around for housing, and to have that consistency over time and to have that expertise at a provincial level is invaluable. The federal government could learn a lot of lessons from provincial agencies like BC Housing in terms of how to create that expert workforce required to deliver on the programs. Again, making the political dreams and expectations a reality requires staff to do that. On the kind of private sector side, I would say that when we were talking about a housing crisis, in some ways it underplays what's actually happening. We have a housing system failure, and it's happening, as you rightly point out, not just here but in multiple cities around the world. And when that happens, every actor in that conversation has to rethink what their role is. And I think in Vancouver, it's fair to say that the private sector have also been doing that. And the increase in appetite to deliver on market rental at a much larger scale, really without the federal incentives that did exist in the 1960s, is an indicator that they also understand what is required to change the world, that change the housing market in the cities that we're living in. You know, in the absence of revolution, and that's not my job, it's somebody else's job, we have to rethink our roles within this in order to try and put back together a housing market that will work for more people.
This is a huge question you've posed. I've started writing my next paper on it. A couple of reflections, perhaps. A number of the cities in Canada have adopted the approach of having 10-year housing plans. Some of this work originated out of the work that Philip Mangano and others in the United States were doing as part of the Interagency Council on Homelessness. But the 10-year plans have been extremely helpful. We did our first 10-year plan in 2009 because they create a focus and targets that go beyond election cycles. Our election cycles being every 4 or 5 years, some even shorter. But it's been extremely important because those have helped inform the cities and the bureaucracies within those cities on what our objectives are. It's taken some time acclimatizing other officials about the legitimacy of 10-year housing plans. But we see it in Toronto as having a 10-year housing plan as being the complementary plan to our official plan. And frankly, not to my liking, the planners have occupied too much of this space too long. when the planners, frankly, do not concern themselves with people. And I can't say it in any stronger language. And so you have seen persons like Abby and myself rise within the city bureaucracies as having stronger voices and having new voices where we were not really there before. And that's really powerful. With respect to the provincial government, in the case of Toronto, and other urban centers in Ontario, we struggle with a provincial government currently and in the past that programs on the same basis as whether you're in a rural village or you're in an urban center. So just by way of example, we have 18,000, in the next 10 years, we have 18,000 households, individuals that will be looking for long-term care. We get the same amount of money from the provincial government to build a long-term care bed in Toronto as you would in Brockville, which is a small village or town of 10,000 people. And so the fact, and similarly federally as well, the programs are all designed for some anonymous community of 15,000 people without regard to the market conditions in which urban centers have to operate. Lastly, I'll just say something about champions and advocates. Wherever you're working, you got to find them. And if you can't find them, you got to nurture them. And so within your provincial government, whether it's an opposition member or whoever, find them, because they will be the champion that is needed. And regardless of who's in power, and in Ontario we have a very right-wing provincial government, they're going to run out of runway. Frankly, in the US, Trump will run out of runway at some point. And we're planning not for this provincial government, but we're planning longer term. We're planning for the next generation. From a municipal perspective, our approach is we're just going to get as much stuff ready as possible so that we have a pipeline. Because what's happened to us in the last 20 years is we stopped creating a pipeline. So when those funding opportunities arrive, we're not ready. Our nonprofit organizations aren't ready. Our whole business in the next 5 to 10 years should be being in a state of readiness, showing what really works, and then when the governments finally wake up, be able to scale up with their support. So this isn't about, oh, Toronto's gone and done it alone. We don't want to be alone. We happen by circumstance to be, but we're going to set the table so that when we're really ready to get going, we're there and we're ready.
Another question? Yes. The last one, maybe? Yes.
Hi, my name is Janice Chan. I work for the City of Calgary. My question is, for all three of your cities, it seems like housing affordability for a certain demographic has driven the political and public interest. But presumably, this hasn't been the case all the time. I'm not sure. Like, it seems like people who are at the level of like trying to enter the housing market, when there's that public outcry for that demographic, it seems like there's that pressure. But what are your thoughts on advancing housing when housing markets aren't so hot for a particular demographic? There's still a great affordable housing need in our city, but I would say there's not as much of that pressure for a certain demographic of people. That's different from Vancouver and Toronto and Paris.
It's also different from Paris. In fact, you know, Paris is a very small city, in fact, even if we are more than 2 million people. And there were more inhabitants in Paris in the past decade than today. And today, Paris lost inhabitants because of the cost. It's also a demographic subject provide us to make more in social housing and affordable housing, but not because of the increase, but because of the loss of families, of people we are going to live outside Paris because it's cheaper. In France, next March, we have a local election in every cities. And of course, in Paris also, the debate has already started. They talk in Paris a lot about housing, but at this time, they're talking a lot about the consequences of the Airbnb economy on Paris. And in the most touristic areas, and there is a lot of touristic areas in Paris, a lot of units are going are not on the rental market and the private rental market. They are just Airbnb units. And I discussed with the mayor of the center of Paris. I don't know if you know Paris, but the Isle just near Notre Dame, the Isle Saint-Louis, and the Isle of La Cité in the center of Paris. I think that there were 800 units on the island, and he told us that now more than 600 were Airbnb units. So it kills everything. It kills the daily life. You don't need school. There is no more shop, and of course there is no more units on the private markets. So that's today really a major problem in Paris. And the other question, I think the politician will have this discussed during the election. See, who are you building to when you are a private investor, when you sell the new building 15,000 or 17,000 euros per square meters? Is it useful? In fact, many people who are buying such units, very expensive units in Paris, are foreigners. This is only flats for 2 or 3 weeks a year, especially in Paris. It has strictly no interest for the housing policy in Paris. So we're now developing a new product with the new law. It's called, we are separated the right for it's for units to be buy. We are separating the land and the use of the units, and the land will be the property of a social housing company or special dedicated company, and we can sell the use of the units to family at very lower price than it used to be in the private market. And this is not a speculative product, because if you are living and if you want to sell, you have to sell it in a price very close to the price you book this unit maybe 5 or 10 years before. So in every city in France, there is a very important movement to develop this kind of products and to continue to build social housing and affordable housing.
I think that there are certain core things about housing policy in Canada which cross different markets. And just because a city is not in a hot market doesn't mean that there aren't certain system failures happening. And even if there isn't the level of outcry, usually from the middle class, about where they can afford to live and what they can get for their money, doesn't mean that won't happen, right? So there's an approach or a thinking that, we might be a canary in the coal mine. It might take other cities and towns 30 years to get there, but there's something built into our market which is going to result in other places getting there too. So all we can do is, I guess, raise a little bit of an early warning system. And largely, I think that's because the system we've created is not linked to income in any way. There is not a consideration. It's that intentional approach or policy where land use policy is linked to the people and the incomes that are likely of those people. I'm sure if you ask the average person in Vancouver in 1980, whether they thought their children would be able to afford to buy the same house that they have bought in 1980, they would have said, yeah, of course, why not? That is no longer the case, right? So these things are often, there are early warnings in a housing system, whether it be hot or not, that still need to be addressed, in my opinion. And that there's a lot that can be done, even if you're not responding in that hot market. Housing, nonprofit housing development is the same, largely, whether you're doing it in an expensive market or not. There are certain key aspects to doing that work which are universal. And so I would just encourage just because you're not facing the same issues as Vancouver, is to not take your eye off the ball and to not become unfocused in your approach, because you don't want to be us. You want to be your own version of the future, which is your own version of who's going to be welcome and who's going to be able to stay in your city. So spend some time thinking about what that is and not just try and avoid the path that we've been on.
I think there's a lot of people that want to help. And you've got to find the structures and the approaches where you can invite them in. When I was president of Raising the Roof, which was Canada's national housing or national homeless charity, we worked with Direct Energy. They were one of the corporate partners that we had. And the reason they were a corporate partner with us was they'd done a survey of their employees on what issue they would want to work on. And any corporation today that is worth its weight recognizes that there's a corporate responsibility in some way to give back. And they had chosen homelessness, and they had chosen my organization to work with. And they raised a lot of money for us. So I think it's about how you organize yourself locally to engage the community. I'm hoping somebody during our session in the next 2 days talks about the Calgary Homelessness Foundation, which is unique in Canada in raising money and activating people. I also think, though, when it gets to what we often would refer to as the hard to house, individuals or families that require supportive housing, you need, like most cases, to have good evidence, and you need champions. You need probably in your community, you have somebody who's doing this work successfully already, and they probably started a project 30 years ago. You need to figure out how they can be supported, and you need to bring in people that can see that that is actually a model that could be replicated. I'm not a fan of pointing fingers. I don't think pointing fingers does anything. And the challenge that I have, and even in the work we're doing in Toronto, we're doing it primarily alone at the moment. But it's not intended to point fingers and say, well, where is the federal or provincial governments? We're just trying to prove that this thing is doable and to find ways where we can welcome them and other partners into the work. I'll just end on this. I have a project that opened, it actually will open next year. It's in downtown Toronto, and it's a luxury condo of about 100 units. They bought a United Church, which frankly the city should have bought, but we weren't quick off the mark. The developer bought the United Church, but there was a shelter for women that was being used. They used that United Church. And in brokering the arrangement with the local city councillor and the developer, once we had taken them through the shelter, he said, well, why don't I incorporate a new shelter as a part of the condominium? And so we have 96 beds for women victims of violence now that will open next year as part of a luxury condominium on Queen Street in our East End. He went back to his marketing team and they told him he was nuts, absolutely nuts. In a week and a half, you sold all the condos. People in Toronto understand that it's better to have somebody housed and have a safe place than being on the street. And if the operators are able to operate and have the confidence, these kind of arrangements are possible. And so I'm getting really excited about using the power of the private sector to take the risks associated with the projects, right? Because there's substantial financial risk. But to marry them with credible and capable organizations and to mix people, and not only low incomes, but to mix actual organizations that are working with the heart to house. And frankly, even in cases of women and people that are homeless. Now, I'm bubbling over with enthusiasm about really where the opportunity is endless, because there is so much public understanding that this is just, the alternative of doing nothing is just a terrible and a bad idea. And frankly, I'll end on this point. I have to, in a month, deliver our 10-year housing plan. And I'm hoping to be able to share that with you, because one of the unique things about the plan is it's going to contain a housing charter that will enshrine a right to housing for residents of our city. Because at the end of the day, it's not about urban design, it's not about architecture, it's about a right to housing.